Hello, my name is Professor Andy Herries. I'm the Head of Department of Archaeology and History at La Trobe University, and I study human origins for a living, human evolution and the early part of the archaeological record. Today, as part of National Archaeology Week here in Australia, I'm going to talk to you about my research at Drimolen Cave in South Africa and our recent discovery of the world's oldest Homo erectus fossil. So Drimolen is located just outside of Johannesburg in South Africa. We excavate there every year, normally during June and July. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go this year, but we run this field school teaching people how to excavate the sites. We take them to some of the other famous sites in the region like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans Cave, and then we take everyone on safari at the end. So it's quite a unique experience. Many of our students come and in their first season unearth human fossils, sometimes like this one, that can completely change our understanding of our own ancestry. So here's some just to sort of show you some of the recent coverage that we got. This is the DNH 134 Homo erectus cranium, also nicknamed Simon, and it got quite a lot of sort of wide coverage in the press, The Guardian, the New York Times, and various other things. So I thought I'd take you on a little bit of a journey to tell you about Drimolen itself and about the discovery of this fossil and what we think this ultimately means for our understanding of human evolution. So for those that don't know anything about human evolution, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background. So ultimately, this is a series, this shows the various different species of human ancestors that we know from about 4 million years down to present day. The ones in red are ones that we find, or if they've got a question mark next to it, potentially find in South Africa, and the other ones are found in other parts of the world. Now, the earliest potential human ancestors, or hominins as we call them, start somewhere between 7 and 5 million years ago, but the evidence at this period is quite sporadic and is very heavily debated. By 4 million years ago, we have the beginning of Australopithecus. This is a series of species that everyone can agree represents part of the human evolutionary line. The earliest examples of these are Australopithecus anamensis and Australopithecus afarensis. Afarensis, the most famous fossil, being the Lucy fossil from East Africa. And it's generally considered that anamensis and afarensis probably represent variation in evolution through a lineage, through time, although the discovery more recently of a more complete anamensis skull has led some to suggest actually they're separate species. So there's no lines connecting all of these different species on here because the variation, how these connect to each other, how one evolved to the other, and ultimately the route through this that led to us, modern humans, is heavily debated. So Australopithecus afarensis occurs until just slightly younger than about 3 million years. And then in South Africa, we have our oldest species of human ancestor, Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa, as I say, named by Raymond Dart in 1925. And that occurs all the way from 3 million years through to about 2 million years ago, when we then have the last occurring Australopithecus, Australopithecus sediba. Some people see this as a different species, other as a late occurring Australopithecus africanus, part of a lineage in the same way that people look at anamensis and afarensis. In Eastern Africa, at this same time, we get the beginning of fossils that have been classified as our genus Homo because they've got larger brains, things like Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, as well as the beginnings of the Paranthropus group. And the Paranthropus is this sort of really weird, often seen as a highly specialized side branch in our evolution that ultimately went extinct, is often seen to have been eating all these hard objects for food. And at Drimolen, we have lots of representatives of the sort of younger species of this, Paranthropus robustus, that occurs down to perhaps as late as 1 million years. From about sort of just after 2 million years, we've got the beginning of Homo erectus. Sometimes the early part of that is split into Homo ergaster, but we're just going to sort of deal with Homo erectus today. And Homo erectus is very long lasting. Until the discovery of our cranium at Drimolen, the oldest evidence for it was about 1.8 million years. And just recently, they dated specimens of it still surviving about 100,000 years ago, which ultimately mean that species overlapped with our own. The origin of our species, Homo sapiens, is about 300,000 years ago. And when we look at that time period, now we have a whole host of different species living on the landscape, which sort of throws out that sort of like the view you have on my t-shirt here of one species evolving to the other through time, one going extinct and the other continuing on. Ultimately, we have lots of different species on the landscape at the same time. We have odd things like the hobbit from Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, or Homo naledi, which was found recently in South Africa, seen to be late occurring, very archaic looking human species. Homo heidelbergensis, that is the common ancestor between us and Neanderthals, which again, just recently, a skull from Zambia was dated to only 300,000 years ago, and again overlapping with us. So human evolution and how we see human evolution is changing all of the time. It was often seen as a linear progression and then as a tree. Now it's often seen as part of a braided river where things are separated and split apart and recombine again. The best example of that is modern humans and Neanderthals, which we now know interbred with each other, and most of us have a little bit of Neanderthal in us today in our genetics. So how do we actually work out the chronology of human evolution? How do we give ages to those fossils? So groups of people work on looking at the anatomical differences between these fossils and looking at how they may relate to each other. Myself, I spend my time working out the age of fossils. There's various ways that you can do this. In Eastern Africa, it's relatively easy to do this in many ways because you can use a method known as potassium argon or argon-argon. So it looks at how one isotope decays to another, a little bit like radiocarbon. And that can date volcanic layers. And you can track the volcanic layers across the landscape using tephrochronology, which basically means you do geochemical signatures of the ash and you can sort of trace it across the landscape. Or paleomagnetism, which is what I do, where you actually look at how the magnetic field of the Earth reverses itself by 180 degrees every now and then. And it does this multiple times over millions of years. And so you can take all of this and build it up into a landscape, and you can use these volcanic layers to trace across the landscape and put your various fossils into a sequence. Now in South Africa, we can't do that. We don't have volcanic material. And the stratigraphy is not linked across the landscape because all of the finds from this early period are within caves. So working out the age of these has been extremely difficult. I've spent the last 23 years trying to do it. We now have some good ages for these sites. So this is what these sites look like. On the top left-hand side is probably one of the most famous sites from South Africa, the site of Sterkfontein. That was once a cave, but doesn't look like it today. It looks a little bit like a big hole in the ground. And ultimately that's what it is. And in actual fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century, miners came in and they mined out the stalagmites and the stalactites from these deposits to use in the gold extraction process. And this is how we found a lot of the first fossils. What you're seeing there is a cave that's completely infilled with sediment. It's become hardened like rock, and then the roof has been eroded through time because these sites are millions of years old. Now, just outside of Johannesburg, there is a massive collection of these what we call paleo caves that are full of human fossils and other animals. And in an area of about 25 kilometers by 10 kilometers, we have all these different sites like Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, Drimolen, Rising Star, where Homo naledi comes from, the site of Malapa, where Australopithecus sediba comes from. And then there's a couple of other sites sort of further north at Makapansgat, and then further to the west at Taung, where the original Australopithecus africanus was found in 1924. So this is a very, very different record from East Africa, and it's been very difficult to work out the ages of these and sometimes the context of the fossils because of all that mining. So over the last 23 years, I've been working on this method called paleomagnetism to work out the age of the sites. And I've been working with colleagues that do uranium lead dating. So again, that's a little bit like radiocarbon that looks at the decay of uranium through to lead, and what we call electron spin resonance dating, ESR, which dates teeth themselves. So we use a combination of these today to help work out the age of the sites. Now, very recently, last year, we published a paper in this the prestigious journal Nature that ultimately showed that these sort of flowstone layers, so like stalagmites in caves, form in these caves, in multiple different caves at the same time period. So you can actually go to different caves and find these flowstone layers of the same age. We were able to date these and show that they formed at very specific periods. What that began to mean was that we could use these flowstones in the same way that people use volcanic layers in East Africa, and we could begin to tie sequences in the different caves and thus all of the human remains together. What we're now doing is now mapping electron spin resonance and paleomagnetism onto this signature so that we can get an even more comprehensive age of how old all of the fossils are. What this has ultimately told us, and we've sort of known this for quite some time, but ultimately we have these late occurring Australopithecus fossils in South Africa. People used to think these were a lot older than they actually are, but we now know that the last specimens of Australopithecus are perhaps only 2.1 to 2 million years old. The skull at the top there, which is the Australopithecus sediba fossil, is around about 1.98 million years. The one just below it, known as Mrs. Ples, which was one of the early finds of Australopithecus africanus, is perhaps only 2.07 million years old, certainly younger than 2.3 million years old. And at around that time, they go extinct and they are replaced on the landscape by specimens of Paranthropus robustus, the one there at the bottom, this big sort of flat face with these big teeth at sites like Swartkrans, and specimens that look more like us and have been classified within our genus Homo. The problem with a lot of the South African fossils that have been related to Homo is they're very fragmentary. So actually trying to work out which species they are has been difficult. Some have been suggested to be Homo ergaster or Homo habilis previously, but often people can't agree. Now, why does this change? Well, ultimately, we don't have a lot of good environmental or climatic data at this time period. But there is some that suggests that around about this time period, about 2.2 million years, there is a significant climatic and environmental shift in South Africa. And ultimately, this appears to potentially have sent some species extinct and others appear on the landscape. The other very cool thing about the caves, you can see there on the left-hand side, that's the Littlefoot fossil, which is the most complete early human skeleton ever discovered. And we can find amazing fossils like this in the caves in South Africa. Some of the other things that we've been doing is, this is another paper that we published in Nature last year, where what we did is we actually measured various elements within teeth. So we looked at lithium, calcium and barium within the teeth of this early species Australopithecus africanus from the site of Sterkfontein. And what that showed us, it can actually give us interesting insights into the diet of those ancestors. And what it showed is that Australopithecus africanus at this site was under quite an amount of seasonal dietary stress. So this is sort of an interesting point, given that we know this is the last Australopithecus species and it goes extinct soon after this. We're also even able to look at things like breastfeeding behavior. We could see that they were breastfeeding their young until at least 1 year old, and then they were weaning them to some degree. But in actual fact, they were going back to using breast milk as a fallback food. So they might be eating hard foods for maybe sort of 8 months of the year, and then they would revert back again. And we get this cyclical cycle, and that's why you see these little reoccurring banded layers in the tooth. This is the sort of thing that when I went to university, you couldn't imagine being able to get this sort of information from fossils of this age. If we go to Drimolen itself, how does Drimolen ultimately fit into this picture? Well, if we look at the site of Drimolen, this is a sort of landscape model that we've done for Drimolen that has, we've done it using a drone. You can see the site there. And it used to be one site. We've now divided it into a number of sites, what we call the Drimolen main quarry, which is the site that's been excavated since 1992 and has all of the hominin remains, and then Drimolen Macondo, which is about 50 meters away, which is actually, we now know, is an older site, and we've been digging there since about 2013. So DMK, I'm not going to speak a lot about this today, but this picture gives you a very good indicator of how heavily eroded. Again, that's a cave, but it's a cave that's been infilled and then significantly eroded. And we know from looking at sort of quartz on the hillside, and we use this method called cosmogenics, that shows us that about 26 meters probably of rock deposit and sediment has been removed from over the top of this cave since it was actually an active cave. We've dated it using electron spin resonance, paleomagnetism and uranium lead to about 2.61 million years. So as I say, we haven't found human fossils here yet, but if we do, we would expect them to be Australopithecus africanus. If we look at Drimolen main quarry, it's called a quarry for a reason. Ultimately, as I say, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, lime miners came in and they mined out all of this basal flowstone that sat underneath all of the cave deposits. And they've made this big hole basically, but there's still the sort of cut through, the in situ sediments are still adhering to the western wall of this quarry area. And actually this sort of quarrying has actually caused some of the deposits sort of to fall in on itself. So the DNH7 Paranthropus robustus skull comes from about where that red dot is, and actually comes from a block that has fallen. And a lot of the early excavation was around that area. So DNH7 is probably what the site has been most well known for. It's the most complete skull ever discovered of Paranthropus robustus, but also is considered to be a rare female fossil. And until recently, it was really the only complete hominid material that we'd actually found at the site. The site also does have archaeology. We've only got about 6 stone tools, not very much at all. It's sort of curious as to why they're so few. Sites like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans have hundreds of stone tools, but they're in a very different part of the landscape. But we do have these bone tools, which are the oldest bone tools anywhere in the world. Now, they're not manufactured to look like that. They're created through use. They're thought to perhaps be used for digging, maybe digging open termite mounds. But we've got over 100 of these now, and I've had a PhD student sort of studying these. The hominid collection, so the human collection at Drimolen now totals over 155 specimens. A lot of the material was found between 1994 and 2007 when it was excavated by the discoverer Andre Kayser. I've been excavating and running excavations at the site since about 2013, and we've added sort of significantly to that sort of collection. So as I say, the majority of it, apart from DNH7, which you can see there on the left, is isolated teeth. And so, we can tell a certain amount from that, but there wasn't many more complete specimens. But things are changing in that regard. In the middle there, you can see the mandible or the jaw of DNH7, and you can see hopefully how big some of the teeth are. That a little tooth that's on the left, the black one, is a Paranthropus tooth from Gondolin, and that shows you how big these can get. I mean, it's about the size of my thumbnail. And on the right hand side, you can see a comparison between Paranthropus and a modern human teeth. You can see how utterly massive they are. There's these big grinding platforms, And often the males, therefore, they have these big chewing muscles that go up to this crest on the top of their head, where the chewing muscles attach, very, very similar to what you see in apes. DNH7 as a female doesn't have that, but still has pretty big teeth. We get lots of juvenile specimens, lots of very young individuals, and this was a study done in 2015, and it showed through synchrotron analysis. So they put teeth into the synchrotron, and then you can actually sit there and count the layers that have formed through the tooth. And what that showed is that we have individuals of Paranthropus and some of Homo at Drimolen that are only half a year old to about 5.5 years old, which is interesting because this is a period, if we look at sort of other primates living in the South African landscape like baboons, they have a very high mortality rate below the age of 5, and so it would seem that our ancestors did too. So one of the things that we wanted to discover was, why are we getting so many fragmentary remains? Why are we getting so many teeth and not many complete remains? Is this because of the nature of how the fossils have accumulated at the site, or is it because how they're preserved at the site because of geological reasons? And ultimately, we've seen a very distinct pattern when we're excavating. You can see one of my former students, Rhiannon, here, digging in what we call a Macondo feature on the left. And this is basically where a tree root has come down into the cave deposit and eaten it away and decalcified it and made it into a soft sediment. And so we excavate through that, and we often find the bones going from one unit to the other. But when we actually plot where all the bones come from, that bit in the middle there, all of the red are fossils. That's actually the same Macondo feature that Rhiannon's digging, and you can see they're all around the edge. All the fossils that were in the middle of the Macondo have sort of gone. They've been dissolved away, or there's been some form of sort of collapse where the material has sort of sunk sometime into lower chambers and cave systems. And so ultimately this began to sort of inform about how we should and where we should be excavating at the site. And ultimately, we started using this and all the other geological information that we'd pieced together to start thinking, right, well, if we excavate here, here, and here, perhaps we'll begin to find more complete remains. And that's exactly what happened. In 2018, and we also found pieces in 2019, and we're not finished yet, we started finding what we believe is a partial hominin skeleton from the site. We don't know what species it is. We're still getting it out. It's still sort of encased in sort of quite hard rock and breccia, but we have rib bones. We have a little bit of a jaw bone and a finger bone. And so we're hoping that we may have an almost complete skeleton here that may come out in the digs over the next sort of few years. In 2018, it was a very good year, 2018. We also found a Paranthropus robustus cranium. So this was found by a second-year field school student from Canada, Samantha Good. And you can, that's Samantha there, and you can see the cranium there just to on the left hand side. And when these things come out of the ground, they look nothing like what they look like in museums. They look like a big blob of sediment, and they've got glue put onto them to consolidate them together. And in actual fact, what we then do is we cut round it very carefully, we lift it out, and you can see my co-director at Drimolen there, Stephanie Baker, on the left hand side, has actually got the cranium in a box. And then my PhD student, Jesse Martin, slowly then essentially excavated it in that box and reconstructed it all back together again. The bit in the sort of red triangle is actually how Sam found it. So the skull was upside down, and she came along the tooth row of the maxilla that was all together, and we dug, and there was more of it and more of it and more of it and more of it, which is very, very cool. So we've started finding these amazing, more complete specimens now. We've sort of changed the way we excavate at the site. And then some of the things, so we published a paper in the journal Science recently, which is another a prestigious journal, a little bit like Nature. And we published this cranium. So this is a new partial cranium, another one found in 2018 of Paranthropus robustus. It's sort of a little bit more fragmented than the other one. So we haven't quite got to it sort of before it sort of started sort of falling apart a little bit more. Ultimately, this is an adult male, so that's very nice that we've got an adult male cranium to go with our adult female cranium, and we can begin to look at differences between males and females. It's unthought of that Paranthropus robustus has quite a lot of sexual dimorphism. In other words, you know, males and females are quite different sizes and have different, the males are more robust. We've also got the younger individuals, so we can look at how did they grow up? Did they grow up the same way as us, as the same way as other different species of human? So this was actually found by the landowner. So we stay, the land that the site is on and we actually stay on is owned by a guy called Keti Nikosi, which you can see there in the middle with my PhD student Jesse Martin. He found the first piece of this. It was really nice for him that he was coming. He's not a paleoanthropologist or anything, but he wanted to come along and excavate with us, and that was great to have him. And so it was also named after him, given that he found the first fossil. Other pieces of it were found by Amber Yeager, who was then at the University of Minnesota near Arizona State, and Eunice, who was at Kansas State as an undergrad, is just about to start at sort of ASU. And they were both on the field school for their first time when they found this material. That brings us to the other thing, which we found a few years earlier. So in 2000, the first more complete cranium that we found was the DNH 134 Homo erectus cranium, or Simon, which is named after our colleague Simon, who unfortunately passed away from cancer recently. But he'd excavated at Drimolen since the very early days, and it felt only fitting that we should name it after him. The cranium itself was discovered by a Trobe University second-year student, now a PhD student with me, Richard Curtis, in 2015. And the entire time Richard was excavating it, he thought it was a baboon because it's a very young individual. It's only 1.5 to 3 years old. And so it's very thin. The cranium's very, very thin. It was in about 150 pieces, and we thought it was a baboon. We find lots of baboons at the site. It wasn't until my co-director Stephanie Baker and my PhD students all started putting it back together again that we suddenly started thinking, well, that's no baboon. The cranium's getting bigger, the brain case is getting bigger, and then we began to realize that it's also not Paranthropus. We find far more Paranthropus at the site than we do Homo. But as it came back together, we was like, oh, this is certainly this is not Paranthropus, and this is not a baboon. And so we then sort of took it off to study, and my two PhD students have been working on the hominid analysis. And ultimately, we knew very early on it was going to be the most complete early Homo cranium from South Africa. But then as we started to do the analysis, we could see that it had its closest affinities to Homo erectus, which has got us very excited indeed. How have we actually defined that? Because obviously it's young. It's only 1.5 to 3 years old. And it's not complete. I mean, we don't have the face or anything like that. Ultimately, it comes down to the shape of the cranium. And there is one other juvenile Homo erectus cranium that's been discovered, and that's the cranium from the site of Mojokerto in Indonesia. And the actual shape of the Mojokerto cranium and the DNH 134 cranium is incredibly similar, has this very characteristic Homo erectus shape. And the Mojokerto cranium is probably a little bit older, about 2 to 4 years old, and but they still have that same shape. Both of them would have still grown, and so ultimately their brain size would have been a little bit bigger than can be measured in the crania at the moment. So Mojokerto has a cranial capacity of about 630 cc's, ours about 538. If we compare that to some other Homo erectus crania that are known, there was a cranium just found recently from Africa, which has a cranial capacity of about 598, is an adult, and is considered to be a female because it's so small. And they were suggesting that actually perhaps in Homo erectus it's still quite sexually dimorphic. And that's a pattern we also see at the site of Dmanisi, where the crania are actually quite significantly different. So that one there that says D2700, about 600 cc's, it is again a juvenile but older than ours, and then D3444 is about 650 cc, and that's an old individual. And those are from the site of Dmanisi in Georgia, and that used to be the sort of best, earliest evidence that we had for Homo erectus, which was interesting because it's not in Africa. And Homo erectus is this very iconic species. It's the first species we know to leave Africa, and it's a species that we consider to be part of our direct ancestry, that all later hominids that led to us have ultimately evolved from. So how do we work out the age of the site? I'm not going to go into this in sort of huge amounts of detail, but this is a photogrammetry model. So we're actually able to create 3D models of the site. We took sort of 6,000 photos of it, and then they were stitched together in a computer program, and this creates a completely color rectified model. So where the stars are where all the hominid material comes from. All of those are in situ apart from DNH7, which comes from this sort of collapsed block. So we were able to show using uranium lead that the basal flowstone formed just prior to about 2.61 million years. So we knew that the fossils couldn't be any older than that. There is another flowstone that sort of caps part of a sequence that's around about 1.78 million years ago, and with us we know that it can't be any younger than that. But the way it became critical to refining the age down to the age that we have is that using paleomagnetism, which is what I do, a PhD student of mine, Tom Mallet, did this work. The bottom of the sequence, the magnetic field of the Earth is pointing towards the South Pole. It's what we call reverse polarity. Whereas at the top of the sequence, it's pointing towards north, like it is today, what we call normal polarity. And ultimately, we actually see the magnetic field of the Earth change through deposition in the site from reversed and pointing south to normal and pointing north. So therefore, we know from studies all over the world when these magnetic reversals of the field take place. So it then became a case of, okay, how do we work out which one of them is it? Because there are many that do go from reversed to normal polarity. Well, the secret to that was that we found this small little flowstone that formed right in the middle of it, and we were able to measure that, and it had a magnetic polarity that was neither one nor the other. It was basically in the middle of this change, and we were able to uranium lead date that to about 1.96 million years, and ultimately there's a magnetic reversal at 1.95 million years. So that pretty much tied it directly in for us. We were also able to do ESR that came out with ages almost exactly the same, 1.965 million years. So we had fossils themselves from this central deposit, the breccia deposit that's forming underneath a vertical entrance, and flowstones sort of sitting at the side of the caves that are laminated into fine-grained material that's been sort of washed from the middle part of the cave to the edges, and we did the paleomagnetism on that sort of fine-grained material, so we're able to tie everything in together. And we've been able to actually show that we can find a magnetic reversal sort of across the cave site, so we can define a band that is basically here is the 1.955 million years, and ultimately all of our fossils lie below that, so we know they're older than 1.95. Another ESR age close to where DNH 134 came from gave an age of about 2.04 million years. So our estimate at the moment is between about 2.04 and 1.95 million years. That ultimately makes the DNH 134 cranium roughly 200,000 years older than the material from Dmanisi in Georgia. So this sort of shows a picture of the site itself, showing again that 1.95 million year sort of reversal layer and the location of the various fossils below it. So we're now confident that the site dates to this period of time, 2.04 to 1.95 million years, which means ultimately it contains the oldest Paranthropus robustus and early Homo in South Africa. At least that is well dated. There are other sites, Swartkrans, Lower Bank, and maybe parts of Kromdraai could be as old, or who knows, maybe older. But the problem at those sites at the moment is there's no real dates for Kromdraai other than biochronology, and at Swartkrans, they know it's sometime between 2.3 and 1.8 million years, but they don't know exactly where within that boundary it is. So, you know, it will be interesting to see whether they get more refined ages and actually find comparable or potentially earlier material at this time period. The site contains over 100 bone tools, again, potentially the oldest in the world. There are bone tools both at Kromdraai and Swartkrans as well, so those could be comparable as well. We have a very small portion of stone tools. I don't expect that to really change. They've been digging for years, but it still represents some of the oldest material in South Africa. The other thing that this date and the analysis showed was that not only were Paranthropus and Homo erectus contemporary in South Africa, but equally they're exactly the same age as the last occurring specimen of Australopithecus in Australopithecus sediba from Malapa. That means you had 3 potential human ancestors on the landscape at this time period. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily met each other, because the resolution in the ages that we've got can't tell us that. They may have been there in different years, in different seasons, and may never have actually met, but they were at least utilizing this same landscape at this same period of time. And the other thing that sort of this brings up is that previously Australopithecus sediba was suggested to be a potential ancestor of Homo erectus itself, because it has some Homo-like features in it. It's called Australopithecus, but it has some Homo-like features, and so was seen as a good candidate for Homo erectus. But the fact that we've got Homo erectus and we've got Australopithecus sediba at exactly the same time perhaps brings some questions into whether that is actually the case or not. Perhaps Australopithecus sediba is just a late occurring Australopithecus africanus that, because of this environmental change that it's occurring at this time period, has undergone certain evolutionary changes that make aspects of it look more Homo-like. Perhaps there are older specimens of it that are yet to be found. If that were the case, then potentially it could be the origin point of Homo erectus. But we see the origin of Homo erectus actually not in South Africa, but probably somewhere else in Africa. But I'll explain that in a minute. If we look at the other fossil material from the site, not just the hominids, we get some interesting patterns as well that sort of seem to fit quite well with what we see in the human material. So in Drimolen main quarry, we have specimens of what's called Dinophelis barlowae, and that's basically a false saber-toothed cat. So it's still got pretty big teeth, but it's not like the old big smilodon saber-toothed cats. And a thing called Lycaenop silverbergi, which is a type of hyaenid. And they are the last time that we see these species in the record anywhere. But we also see another species called Dinophelis pivotoi, which is another type of false saber-toothed cat. And that's the first point that we see that, and we find it in younger sites. So it's like a crossover point where we see the last occurrence of certain species and the first occurrence of others in the carnivores. But we also potentially see that same sort of sequence in things like the antelopes. So at sites prior to Drimolen, we have this species called Gazella van Hopeni, whereas at Drimolen itself we have this species called Antidorcus recci. Now, Antidorcus recci is known from Eastern Africa earlier than this, but this is one of the first times we see it in South Africa, and it probably filled the same sort of niche on the landscape as Gazella van Hopeni. So, and also Homo erectus itself, ultimately it's the first occurrence of this on the landscape, and we don't see it prior to that. And we get Paranthropus and we get all these stone tools all suddenly occurring at the site. This seems to be quite rapid, and so we don't see this as sort of an evolutionary trend within South Africa, but perhaps sort of migrations into South Africa from elsewhere, and this sort of turnover effect with species going extinct and new ones migrating in. So how do we put all of that big picture together? Well, ultimately, you know, I think that this idea sort of fits quite well with what we know of the record. One of the biggest problems that we have as paleoanthropologists studying the human record, human fossils are very rare. We always say that there's more people studying them than there are human fossils themselves. But equally, there's a huge geological bias to the record. We know lots and lots about human evolution in South Africa. We know lots about it in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, but virtually nothing about the early part of the human record in the entire of the rest of Africa. So for us to sit and say, oh, we've got the oldest Homo erectus in South Africa, must be where it evolved, I think, is difficult. I think that it comes from somewhere in Africa, but it may come from somewhere that's not either of those two places. We know that just prior to this, that we've got Homo erectus already out and has left Africa by 1.8 million years, those Dmanisi crania that we see there at the top. But equally, it spreads relatively rapidly into the rest of Asia. Atlantean in China, it's there by at least 1.63 million years. The Mojokerto cranium, that other little juvenile skull, is in Indonesia by 1.49 million years. There may be older fossils of Homo erectus there back to 1.66 million years. So there seems to be a relatively rapid spread throughout the world. Also Neolantian in China is a series of stone tools that were recently dated as far back as 2.14 to 1.98 million years. So the exact sort of same time period as DNH 134 from Drimolen in South Africa, two of the furthest ends of the earth that you could really get. Now, we don't know which human ancestor was making those stone tools, and it's been suggested by the people that published them that perhaps it was a species that is prior to the occurrence of Homo erectus. But now we have Homo erectus in South Africa at that time period, and I think that Homo erectus is probably a good candidate for that. And I think what this shows is that Homo erectus was expanding its range at around this period just prior and around 2 million years. Some species find themselves going out of Africa. They didn't have a map, obviously, they didn't know where they were going, but they eventually go out of Africa and make it all the way to China. Others move from some other area of Africa and come south and ultimately hit South Africa, which, is a little bit like a sort of cul-de-sac at the bottom of South Africa. So it's probably part of a wave of migrations related to changing climatic and environmental conditions at this time period. Europe itself, species struggle to get into Europe, but the oldest evidence we have is from Orce in Spain at about perhaps 1.4 million years, or maybe Cima de Elefanti by 1.2 to 1.1 million years, although they argue that those specimens are sort of different from Homo erectus, something they call Homo antecessor. But I think this is a really nice evolving picture, and we've now got this very early part of the Homo erectus lineage here at Drimolen in this early part of its phase of movement. So ultimately, thank you for listening. I know it's quite a long video, but ultimately, if you have any questions, I'm easy to find. As the head of department of the Trobe University Archaeology, you'll find me on Twitter. But we also have to thank lots of funding bodies, lots of people that have helped pay for our research, and lots of other collaborators. This work is a collaborative team effort involving people from all over the world. And ultimately, if you're a student, you're interested in paleoanthropology, you want to get involved, well, come and study with us at the Trobe, or come on the field school in South Africa when we can all leave our bedrooms at home and get back out into the field.